Ms. Baoli, and yes, please.
Okay, good afternoon, everyone.
You
My-
haven't plugged your computer
Yeah.
in.
You need,
Do you know how to operate it?
Chenxi,
unplug
could
it,
you
plug.
move the water? Could you put it on the floor maybe?
Huh?
Yeah, or sit it here. Anywhere. Thanks.
On floor.
Yeah, thanks.
It's your water.
It's her water, but it's
Okay.
blocking the
I
camera.
see. That one. The one after the circle. You're taking note of
Yeah,
I will not take photo.
but mine's video.
Yours nice too.
Mine's
Okay.
video.
Okay.
Thanks.
Good afternoon, everyone. My presentation is Labyrinth of Identity, the influence of English poetry in translation on Chinese literature from 1917 to 1949. First of all, please let me introduce my three main objectives of research. The original English poems refers to the source texts translated into Chinese by Chinese poets from 1917 to 1949. Translated versions in Chinese means the Chinese poetic lines translated by Chinese poets from the original English poems. Original Chinese poems are the Chinese poems composed before and after the poets translated the English poems. By the comparison between the three different categories of poems, I try to illustrate how English poetry in translation influenced the formation of modern Chinese poetry and how Chinese poets established their own identity within the framework of modern world literature in the early 20th century. For this project, I will apply close reading and comparison as my methodology. By close reading, the subtle similarities and the differences are easily observed, and by comparison, the changes and the developments can be traced. At the beginning, I would like to set two examples to distinguish classical Chinese poems and modern Chinese poems. This is the Bastinier's, a typical classical poem. This poem includes all kinds of elements of classical poems, 7 or 5 syllables in each line, symmetric couplets and images, classical Chinese. And this is the typical modern poems. 刘半农死, tell me how to not miss her. You know, the differences between those two are in the lines, language, motif, and the rhyme. In general, parallelism, which requires perfectly symmetrical contrast of images and words in a couplet, is the most significant characteristics of classical Chinese poetry, while the modern poetry emphasizes the freedom of forms and contents, especially the vernacular language. It is not difficult to know that the huge translation of Chinese poetry happened in the beginning of the 20th century. But the question is, why the classical Chinese experienced such great change? How was the new identity of modern Chinese poetry obtained? If the vernacular language is the only force to launch this literary reform, why is it changed so suddenly after since a Chinese vernacular language has existed for a long time? From the social background, around May 4th movement, China was undergoing an anti-imperial protest against the Western invasion and the upsurge of the Chinese nationalism. As John King Fairbank said, After this moment, the tyranny of the classics has been broken. In the literary field at that time, by publishing literary monthly magazine, the youth magazine, Chengdu Xiu opened a new culture movement. In this historical movement, pioneers advocated democracy, freedom, liberty, and writing in vernacular rather than in classical language. At the same time, various foreign literatures were introduced into China by translation and influenced Chinese literature significantly. With the help of these translations, Chinese writers destroyed their prosaic chains, imitated the techniques of writing, and gained the encouragement of innovation and new identity. At the start, they chose Chinese poetry to be the first target of this kind of literary reform motivated by the translations. In part 1, let's go back to the brief history of translation of these English poems at that time in China. According to the different identity situations of the Chinese poets and the various relative relationships among the original English poems, the translated Chinese versions, and the subsequent Chinese poems composed by the translators, I divided this time into 3 different periods as follows: identity lost, identity disorder, identity regained. Before identity was to be lost, I should mention the previous classical identity of the translators of English poems before 1917. Even there are debates about the earliest translation of English poem into Chinese. It is safe to say that almost all of the Chinese versions of English poems are translated into classical Chinese, and the translators, who also played as poets, identified themselves as classical poets. Here is the example of Su Meishu's representative of the translation before 1917. He translated poems of Robert Burns, Byron, and Shelley in the fashion of classical Chinese poetry. The way he translated is exactly the way he composed his own poems. Even with a complicated background, having a Japanese mother and being abandoned by his Chinese father, he attempted to gain his identity with Chinese by writing classical Chinese poems. At that time, generally, these poets has a stable identity with the classical poetry. In the very year of 1917, as an overseas student at Columbia University, Hu Shi proclaimed his statement of reform poetry in new use. Then the identity lost period came to us. In this essay, Hu Shi proposed in poetry, one should do not imitate the ancients, eliminate old cliches, do not use couplets or parallelism, do not avoid popular expressions or popular forms of characters. All of the suggestions mean the betrayal of tradition and the break of the old rule of poem writing. Later, he put his theory into another thesis, constructive literary revolution, a literature of national speech, in which he said one should speak what do you want to say, and say it in the way you want it to say. Speak what is your own and not that of somebody else. Speak in the language of the time in which you live. By speak what you want to say and say it in the way you want to say it, and speak what is your own and not that of somebody else. Hu Shi tried to persuade himself and other poets in China to establish the confidence of expressing and identifying himself. Let's remember the sentence: speak what is your own and not that of somebody else. So Hu Shi put his theory